Every year since 1989, the Library of Congress has selected 25 films to add to the National Film Registry. The criteria? The films must be culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant.
Each week on You're Missing Out, we take a look at one of these films to try and get to the heart of why they were selected and why they still matter.
Our guest today is the head of content development and distribution for the animation studio Hero for Hire Creative and is a longtime friend of the show. Back with us again, and we are all very excited. Jordan Beck is here, this time to discuss Magical Maestro. Jordan, thank you so much for joining us once again.
Hey, thanks for giving me the call.
Welcome back for what is sure to be the lengthiest episode we have recorded, where no issues will come up. We will have no controversies to deal with, no deep, dark backstories Mike is going to have unearthed in his research. Nothing but good times, good vibes. Go New York, go, as the kids like to say.
This is, yeah, that, I mean, it's worth noting. So we have done short films on the show previously, in our other seasons. We have done some short films. This might be, I'd have to do that. This might be the shortest that we've done.
I feel like it has to, because we've done a Looney Tunes, but that was
What's Opera
definitely
Doc
longer than this.
Yeah,
right?
What's Opera Doc's a little heftier. Because I'm trying to think shorts wise, like, What's Opera Doc, Gertie the Dinosaur is like 12 minutes. And then even in like the live action stuff, like Meshes of the Afternoon is like longer.
20, 30 minutes, something like that.
So this might right now be the shortest film we have covered.
I have a question. If you know the answer to this, what is the shortest film in the registry?
I'm going to take a shot in the dark. I don't know it for a fact, so somebody can correct me, but it's got to either be one of the two Edison shorts, Newark Athlete or Blacksmith Scene, which are like a handful of seconds, or possibly, and I could be wrong here, I believe they're the color bars. Just straight up, just color bars are.
The test pattern?
Yes. Yeah.
How long is this a Zapruder film?
That's interesting, because I
mean, the important part is like 15 seconds. But
yeah.
That's what I mean, yeah.
I mean, we would have to find out too, because this is what I
the
have to get
fun
into.
Part, basically.
I have to get into like what's. I've been trying to figure out from them, and sometimes we have some correspondence with like what version of what is in, because our listeners will have already heard that we did Blade Runner. As of right now,
oh god, yeah.
As of right now, they have not gotten back to me about which version of Blade Runner is in, and there's several.
Oh, wow. Yeah, aren't there three?
So there's
three official.
Five.
There's
five.
There's the final cut, the director's cut, the theatrical, the work print. I've got the big box set over here,
and the final cut.
Yeah. I got to go through again. We're recording these a little out of order, so that episode will have already happened, but we have not done it yet. So we'll probably just wing it. We'll probably just what?
We know that already?
Yeah, that episode's, because that episode comes out first. That's what starts.
Oh, that's
the
a
season.
Phil episode?
Correct. Oh my god. So we don't know. I don't know what version of the film we're talking about, and Tom does not know who will be here talking about it. We're off to a stellar start, but we know who is here right now talking about Magical Maestro, which is Jordan Beck. As I said up top, longtime friend of the show, has been here for Snow White, has been here for Fantasia.
Hell yeah.
And when I sent over the list of titles, said, I guess I'm the cartoon guy. Let's do Magical Maestro.
Well, I will go ahead and set the stage for this one. I am not nearly as well versed in Tex Avery history as I am in Walt Disney. So this was an interesting one for me. Like I had to do a little bit extra research on this, and I think I probably am coming with more questions than answers.
Well, it's funny because I think everybody is in that boat. At least culturally. Maybe not Mike, because he'll probably come up with some backstory about how his dad was some weird, like, pro Tex Avery, anti Looney Tunes, had like all sorts of Tex Avery merch in the house, and Bugs Bunny was banned because he was like, I don't know, a troublemaker or something. And we fought, but like everybody, I feel like Tex Avery had a moment thanks to the mask, but
Tex Avery has cultural cachet, but without, he's sort of like in a David Lynch sense with that, right? Like people will say things are
you kind
David
of just
Lynchian,
know
but they've
the
never
wolf.
seen. Yeah.
But
Well,
like, but and you know, you look at just even like looking at the Wikipedia page on it, it's the only Tex Avery in the registry. So it almost feels like in '93 they were kind of like, you know, we've done Disney, we've done the old Loonies. I guess we should put a Tex in here. Which one should we put in? Mike, I know you probably figured their first two choices was his two cracks at Uncle Tom's Cabin.
There, yeah, that's right. That is so. So, Jordan, I don't know if you're aware of this. Tom's bringing this up because I have mentioned. About a year ago, when I was going through old Warner Brothers shorts, I came across his first the Tom's referencing. It's called Uncle Tom's Bungalow, which is a parody of Uncle Tom's Cabin that is even more offensive than you're imagining.
Is it like a Hollywood 1940s kind of situation,
So
or
it's
like
so it's
post-war?
Well, it's. I don't remember exactly what year it comes up, but it's basically it's spoofing Uncle Tom's Cabin because at the time Uncle Tom's Cabin was like considered the great American novel, right? It would be in one sense, I'm sure in Tex's mind, because of the place that Uncle Tom's Cabin had in pop culture at that time. It's like, well, it's no different than if today you were to do a spoof of Star Wars or The Great Gatsby. Like it's just a story that everybody knows. Except, of course, that this story is about the inhuman abuse of enslaved people. So every joke is 1,000 times more tasteless, right? So, like, again, if you were doing, like, if Looney Tunes was doing a spoof of The Great Gatsby, and and it was like, oh, when Daisy's drunk driving the car, they have somebody doing a voiceover as a NASCAR announcer, you'd be like, that's a funny bit, Tex. But when it's the slaves running away from Simon Legree and you have a football commentator on it, you're like, hey, Tex,
Oh my god!
these are runaway
Oh
slaves.
my god!
This is
No.
this is horrendous.
Man.
Like it's legit. It's
Now it's just making me wish for, as bad as this sounds, someone redoing it, but instead of football commentary from them, overlaying Tony Romo and Jim Nantz talking over it.
Jesus Christ. I mean, listen, Tom, anyone can. That short is public domain because weirdly, Warner Brothers was like, let's not renew the copyright or acknowledge this.
Why would
Let's
they
just
do? That seems so strange. Why wouldn't they want to sign that forever?
Yeah,
Well,
I believe.
mean, of all the great Warner Brothers things that they've just decided to not release, it's Uncle Tom's Bungalow, Batgirl. They're on the same level.
Well, I believe
Yeah.
so. Uncle Tom's Bungalow is part of what is called the Censored 11, which we've talked about before on the show, I think. But the reason Tom brought that up, Jordan, is that today I was going through Tex Avery's filmography and discovered that later he made another short called Uncle Tom's Cabana. And I'm
saw
like,
that
why
title.
do it twice? Why do it? You did it once. You didn't need to do it once. You went
a novel
back
so
to the
nice
well.
you had to parody it twice.
And yeah. So anyway, talking about Tex Avery though, and Tex Avery's place, I think there is a little more to it than what's being suggested here in terms of like having a revival because of the mask. I think it's in a way, we're probably like at the tail end of knowing who Tex Avery was in outside of like animation academia. And the reason I say that is that you had this moment. A lot of these guys that we all love to listen to, these filmmakers that we enjoy, as Tom and I often evoke, like those Joe Dante, John Landis commentary tracks on
Right,
seemingly
right.
every DVD, where they're like, well, and of course,
Every
Tex
DVD.
Avery and Chuck Jones. Part of that comes out of the fact that our parents' generation when they were in college, studios started packaging cartoons and sending them to college campuses, like, renting them to college campuses, packaging them based on the creators. Now, when you watch these cartoons on TV, you would see like, a Chuck Jones, a Tex Avery, or you'd see like the names of the producers, right? You'd see Walter Lantz or Leon Schlesinger, one of those. But people who grew up watching those on television, people our parents' age who watched those on television, they were the ones that took note of who was making these cartoons and where those authorial touches were, right? You knew when a Bugs Bunny short was a Chuck Jones versus a Tex Avery. That's what they knew. They began to notice that in a way that people going to the theater and seeing them, our grandparents who would see them first run, they didn't know that, right? They were just like, oh, it's another Porky Pig. Great, right? Mm-hmm. What that evolves into is that those people who watched those on college campuses and were obsessed with Tex Avery, Chuck Jones, were obsessed with the auteurs behind these cartoons. Once they are involved in actually airing and programming this content, they are tailoring it to that. And the reason I bring that up is, of course, Cartoon Network, 24 hours of cartoons, right? My first introduction to Tex Avery was not, as Tom suggested, my father having a weird anti-Looney Tunes Tex Avery approach, as though he would just like stroll into the living room and go, get that goddamn Tasmanian devil off the television and find a screwy squirrel. Like, that did not happen.
Come on. This is the guy who, what movie was it when you were 8 years old, goes, you didn't see, was it Casablanca?
Citizen Kane. It was Citizen Kane.
You haven't seen Citizen Kane? No, I'm 8 and you're my father.
If I was going to see it, it would be because you put the tape in the VCR.
Good chance you knew. You were a part of everything I do. I'm 8.
So the reason I bring this up is that in the 90s, you started getting a lot of embrace of these animators as auteurs, right? The names Chuck Jones and Tex Avery started being used as part of the marketing, as part of this. And so there's one of two ways that people our age would have been introduced to the name Tex Avery beyond just in the credits of cartoons. One of them might be a bit familiar. I want to see if this works. Kyle, can you cue up the clip that I have labeled Clip 1? It would have been so great if he just said no.
No, I'm not going to do that. Can I? Yes. Will I?
Oh. I will edit around all of this empty space, obviously.
No, this is beautiful. You got to let the silence in sometimes.
So how about the Super Bowl?
So let's see if this...
Yeah, let's talk about the end zone paintings for the Super Bowl. I think that'll be really good and non-controversial.
Imagine if Chuck Jones was tasked with painting the end zone for the Chiefs.
Chuck Jones, you'd be okay. Tex Avery, you'd have a
Tex
problem.
Avery, excuse me.
It would be a real problem.
Tex
Avery, excuse me.
There was not a racial stereotype that Tex Avery didn't find funny. Okay, that's what you learn watching those films.
Almost none that you couldn't find in Magical Maestro.
He crammed them all in. He
managed a nice good 6-minute version of racism. It's like the TikTok of the day.
Kyle, do you have that clip? Oh, you legitimately do not? Okay, it was in the drive, but that's fine. We'll get back to this.
Listen, it's fine. This is only the reason why you're here, but fine, fuck you.
All right. So the reason I brought this up, I'll just skip over, pretend none of that happened. The reason I brought this up is one of two ways you could have been introduced to the name Tex Avery. One of them was that they had a block of cartoons on the early Cartoon Network that was devoted to Tex Avery. And if you remember, like, the opening credits of it showed the wolf and Screwy Squirrel and all of his characters. And there was like do you remember this? There was a Bebop intro to it where it's like, he's got style, he's got flair, Tex Avery. And they just kept repeating the name, right? They kept repeating it. And then it would just be like the classic Tex Avery shorts that we all came to know and love, right? And sometimes it would be the lesser known ones, but it would be, all of the Red Hot Riding Hood variations, all of those, because by this point Turner, I believe, owned the Looney Tunes stuff and the MGM stuff, or it might have been at least the MGM stuff. I Love to Sing, those kind of things. Now, there's another way that you could have learned about Tex Avery. And this is something that if anybody is like deep on like animation Twitter or animation Reddit, which two of the people on this podcast, it's possible, and one avoids that like the plague. But if you are in
that
this
straight
space,
up sounds like don't be allowed near schools.
so
with, like
there was
board.
a revival of interest in this bizarre and awful thing. Remember, we're saying at this time in the 90s, like, the name of animators matters, right? You have a Chuck Jones block and a Tex Avery block in Cartoon Network. And so similarly around this time, a French animation company wanted to make a cartoon show based on the work of Tex Avery. And Tex Avery had been dead at this point. His wife wanted to send like the kids or the grandkids to college. So she agreed to license his name to this French animation studio, which made an animated show called The Wacky World of Tex Avery. And I know we don't have this clip. Everybody look it up. It is one of the most obnoxious opening credit sequences of any show you will ever see. And the most upsetting thing is the Tex Avery block on Cartoon Network was all of the best Tex Avery cartoons. The Wacky World of Tex Avery did not have the rights to any of Tex Avery's characters. So they just made up their own characters. And when people then began to say, then why is it called The Wacky World of Tex Avery? They created a little cowboy character and named him Tex Avery so that the show title made sense.
And this was the French, you said?
This was the French. Yes, Tom.
Another notch in my belt.
So people
fucking French.
People our age would have been exposed to the name Tex Avery in one of those two ways, right? And so you either associate it with those classic Warner Brothers and MGM cartoons, right? There's a lot of the droopy stuff, as we mentioned, the wolf and Screwy Squirrel and Butch the dog. Or you associate it with kind of this generic, zany cartoon nonsense. And I think...
Or...
Yeah.
You remember, like I said, you remembered from The Mask, because I genuinely would posit that for a good chunk of our generation that wasn't really into cartoons as kids, just kind of like had them on and don't even think about them now, they will remember the wolf. They will use the gif of the wolf on Twitter or Facebook because they remember The Mask, and thus that's like the closest they'll ever get to remembering Tex Avery.
Well, and the other big...
Because there's a lot of people that aren't losers like us.
But I'm saying there's the other big film, which is Who Framed Roger Rabbit, lifts a lot from Tex Avery's animation style.
But both The Mask and Who Framed Roger Rabbit don't use the name Tex Avery.
No.
Like they don't name check him. But The Mask at least is one where like all of the reviews, which when we were 8, we weren't really like reading the variety review of The Mask, right? But the conversation around The Mask is, they use this kind of Tex Avery animation style. But I looked up the Cartoon Network block, and it's possible that the first result is from a later iteration of that, but it looks like at least the top YouTube result for that intro you were talking about was 1996, which would have been after The Mask. So The Mask would have been the thing that like, hey, people are into this particular old school cartoon. And this may be jumping the gun a little bit, but that also happens to coincide with the swing revival. So everybody's listening to Big Bad Voodoo Daddy and the Cherry Poppin' Daddies and Royal Crown Review and Brian Setzer Orchestra.
Thank you for making cartoons.
Sure.
I just want to
another thing we can thank Jon Favreau for.
And really and truly, like The Mask comes out in 94, Swingers comes out in 95. Everybody's got a wallet chain and a zoot suit by 96. And
little Van Dyke beard going on,
it's great. I really hope that we play clips of all of those bands I just named too, so that way you have to pay the licensing in perpetuity, because that'll be really fun.
Oh boy, this is
They'll be
this
waiting for their checks.
is getting dangerous now.
Are they in public domain yet? By God, we're old enough.
Listen, Brian, I could call in a favor with Brian. That I could manage. My mom was childhood friends with Brian. I could call in a favor. That's not a joke. That is
The
legitimately
most
real.
famous one. That's
That is-
awesome.
that
I
is
was
legit.
thinking Royal Crown Review had to be the easy one to get.
No, he grew up in the house next door to my mother.
Oh my
Apparently,
God,
so
that's amazing.
when they were like she always found that weird that like here was Brian Setzer on TV, you know, with the Stray Cats, and she was like, he played Horsey in our backyard. What is this?
Oh, that's so
What are we
cool.
doing here? Yeah. It's very weird. It's deeply odd. And funny enough, animation connection there, because Brian Setzer would go on to record the theme song to House of Mouse.
He
So it
would.
all
And
comes
he
together.
also appeared in the classic Disney film, The Country Bears. That has nothing to do with animation or Tex Avery. I just think The Country Bears is underrated.
Is
And-
he in Country Bears? I've seen
Oh,
Country
yeah.
Bears, and I don't
He's
remember
in
him
it. He is in it. He has an original song about doing it all for the honey. It's actually a good movie. I will go to the mattresses over Country Bears not being that bad.
Well, that's okay. It's we'll get back to Magic Ocean, but you should know, Jordan, Country Bears, or The Country Bears, is the one piece of what Tom would call Disney theme park bullshit that he gets on board for. Because slightly, because at one point I introduced him to the character of Big Al, and Tom's response was just, hell yeah.
I get that guy.
That there's just this sad, drunken bear with a song about being surrounded by blood.
Listen, you show me a drunken oaf, and I'm there.
He's so
I'm
depressed.
guessing, Tom, you probably didn't see the 2002 live action Country Bears movie.
No, I did not. And
Starring featuring the music of Bonnie Raitt and Don Henley, and starring Christopher Walken.
Sad to say, I haven't, and good chance I never will.
The thing is,
it's Christopher Walken's masterpiece.
The truth is, I think he might actually like it, because it's just
good.
It's just
okay,
too weird to have existed.
Yeah, it's super weird, and it's a bunch of people like Christopher Walken and Dietrich Bader who know exactly what this movie is, and they're just enjoying the paycheck and inviting us to enjoy it with them.
It's also during that period where it's not dissimilar to like what happened with like an Ang Lee's Hulk, insofar as like the studios were like, listen, we know we want to make comic book movies and we don't know what they should look like, so do whatever. Country Bears is in production before Pirates of the Caribbean comes out, so it's that period where Disney's like, we want to make movies based on our theme park attractions, but we don't know what'll work, so here's the IP, here's some money, go do whatever. And you
Figure it out, guys.
You watch Country Bears knowing that as soon as Pirates of the Caribbean comes out, they're like, oh, that's what we do. You watch Country Bears and go, man, there was no oversight on this set.
Nobody was there to say no. And and the world, I love that we are 20 minutes into a podcast about Tex Avery, and I completely derailed it already to talk about the live action Country Bears movie. That's great.
So
I'm helpful.
Well, anyway, to bring us back,
it's not like we're trying to avoid anything.
To bring us back to Tex Avery, I think there's something interesting about why he gets in now and why this gets in. Because you mentioned that, we were talking about that block on Cartoon Network, and if memory serves, originally Cartoon Network had done a Chuck Jones block, right? That was successful, so they did a Tex Avery. And similarly, a Chuck Jones short gets in before a Tex Avery short in the registry, right?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of the animation they induct, you've got Snow White, and then you start with Snow White in the first year, then Fantasia. Okay, then we got to do Gertie the dinosaur. This all tracks. When I think about, like, especially the early days of the registry, the mentality is like, hey, if everything's about to explode and we have to preserve these important pieces of culture, like, yes, obviously, you go Gertie because that's the foundation. Then it's What's Opera Doc. And then this year, the fifth year, they go, okay, we did a Chuck Jones, we should pick a Tex Avery. And I think there's also a sense of, well, we've done Warner Brothers animation and we've done Disney animation. We should do an MGM animation, right? Because they keep that pattern going, because next season we'll be doing a Fleischer, right? They tend to kind of, and then I think the next year is a UPA, right? So there is an interest in spreading the studio wealth. But I also think you get the sense, to one degree or another, that part of the reason that they go Chuck Jones first, both in the case of Cartoon Network and the Registry, is that Chuck seems like he was probably an easier guy to get along with.
Well,
is the
and
impression I get.
Chuck also is more prolific
Mhm.
than, I mean, anybody other than Walt Disney, and Walt Disney's hands-on proliferation is like kind of, you know, questionable when it comes to the animation. But like Chuck Jones, you know what a Chuck Jones thing looks like, and you can name, even if you're a little kid and you can't exactly name Chuck Jones,
Mhm.
you know what the Looney Tunes are, you know what the Grinch is. Like there's
Yeah.
there's a level of ease of recognition. I'm not one for auteur theory. It's of my generation of film studies majors. But, you know, I kind of push back against the idea that one dude is responsible for the work of 100. However, with Chuck Jones, there is definitely a big old thumbprint on the
It's
work.
just a level of iconography that Chuck Jones holds that,
Right.
you know, even in the cartoon boom of the 90s, you know, the Looney Tunes had their explosion with the Michael Jordan commercials, which led to Space Jam. Joe Dante always do, like we said, Joe Dante
Mhm.
always with the Looney Tune stuff. The Grinch was ever popular, which led people to thinking, hey, let's make a live action Grinch movie, and thus unleashed hell upon earth with that fucking Jim Carrey movie.
One year it'll get in and it's going to upset us.
And then
We've been fearing for it every
that
year.
is the year I become a Luigi.
From the video game Super Mario Brothers, Tom.
Yes,
Yes.
that's exactly what I mean.
So like, yeah, but with Chuck Jones, there's a super fit thumbprint. And with Tex Avery in general, yes, there's obviously like, you know, you can, if you don't exactly know the name Tex Avery, whatever, but you know what that horny wolf is.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Like, you know, the Tex Avery style. But I think it's interesting that I didn't realize the exact timeline that you were saying that things went into the Registry.
Mm-hmm.
That the Tex Avery they picked is a non-IP one-off.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a Droopy.
Yeah.
You know, and Tex Avery was somehow more necessary to get in before a Hanna-Barbera, and Tom and Jerry, or a Flintstones, or a Jets. I mean, Hanna-Barbera is like super iconic and also very easy to recognize, especially the deeper you get into the 70s and 80s. The Hanna-Barberas are very easy to spot.
Yeah.
But Tex Avery is kind of a, like, yeah, he was integral in the Looney Tunes development, and yeah, he created Droopy, who's in Roger Rabbit, but he's not necessarily a, like, you know, Screwy Squirrel isn't a character who people are wearing merch of today.
It's interesting. Tex would say something similar, because Tex did not view himself as a character guy. He said, I'm not a star maker, I'm a gag man. Right? And similarly, you know, Warner Brothers, when they celebrate the birthday of Bugs Bunny, right? Bugs Bunny technically appears before the short A Wild Hare. But his personality isn't formed until A Wild Hare, and that is a Tex Avery. Tex Avery is instrumental in that, and in fact, Tex Avery maybe made the greatest contribution to Looney Tunes history. And it's not given enough credit. You know where I'm going with this, right?
Yeah.
Do you know this, Tom?
No, of course not.
So when Tex Avery was growing up in Texas, because obviously that's where his nickname comes from, when he was growing up in, I think, East Texas, the thing around school is that everybody, like, it was the fun, quirky nickname would just be to go, hey, Doc, how's it going, Doc? And you just call everybody Doc. So when it's time for Bugs Bunny to introduce himself, he does, hey, what's up, Doc, comes from Tex. And apparently Tex would years later would be mystified that this had caught on so much, because as he would put it, he goes, I thought that was just what everybody did. I didn't realize that hadn't really made its way out of East Texas. I thought that was just everybody knew that.
It was like, yo, dude. But, hey, what's up, Doc, was just Dallas high school slang in 1930.
But he thought it was as ubiquitous as doing the carrot chomping as a parody of It Happened One Night, and obviously that's something that gets lost with time too, but the whole idea of having him chomp on the carrot was, well, everybody and their mother has seen It Happen One Night, so they're going to know what this is. And in Tex's mind, what's up, Doc, is like, well, everybody knows that's what we say. And only finds out later, oh, I guess that was just a weird little Texas thing I brought in. But that's all to say, Tex didn't view himself as a character guy, though, of course, as we mentioned, he has the wolf. And Screwy Squirrel aside, what you do also have is in this short, it's not just a one-off character, because Butch, the dog, appears in a number of Tex Avery shorts, incling some.
Yeah, but Butch wasn't a Bugs or a Daffy or something.
Oh no, no. But he had his appearances. In fact, I learned just today, I hadn't realized, Butch's name originally was Spike. They called him Spike. I think when he first appears in, I think his first short is Bad Luck Blackie, which is,
don't love that name.
That sounds like it's not
about
a good time.
It's about a black cat, to be clear.
I'm sure that
doesn't necessarily
that's true.
Clear it up.
The short, to be clear, it's one of his best. So it's about, there's this big dog now called Butch, but he was Spike then. This big dog is torturing this poor little white kitten. He just like keeps bullying this kitten. And so this black cat shows up and he's like, hey man, I don't know if you know, black cats are unlucky. I can throw my bad luck at anybody. And it's kind of a prototype of Magical Maestro insofar as like this black cat uses his bad luck to just fuck with this dog in various ways. The reason he had to change the name was that there is a Spike the dog in Tom and Jerry.
I was going to say, isn't that the name of the bulldog in Tom and Jerry, right?
Yeah. And so now he's Butch, but what they ended up doing is in one episode of the Tom and Jerry show from 2014, which was like I think a Flash animated show on Cartoon Network, they had Butch and Spike meet and find out that they're long lost brothers, which I think is a fun bit. That's a fun bit for nobody but us, but that's
right.
a fun bit. I was
going to say, like,
that's
a really great reference for this podcast and this podcast alone.
The deepest of deep cuts, especially because who else but me is watching modern day Tom and Jerry?
Flash animated Tom and Jerry.
So after a bit of technical difficulties, that seems like our sign that we should stop talking about country bears and start talking about this specific Tex Avery short, Magical Maestro. But before we say what we thought of Magical Maestro, let's hear what the Library of Congress had to say. Here's what the National Film Registry said about Magical Maestro.
Magical Maestro. When the snobby star, the great Puccini, refuses to let Misto the magician conduct the opera, Misto gets even with the help of his magic wand. Animator-director Tex Avery employed his wry sense of humor and sarcasm to give the cartoons he produced, this one for MGM Studios, greater appeal to adults.
So, we were talking about this before, but it is interesting that this is the short that they pick. And I think part of the reason that this is the one that they pick is that sometimes they are picking the creme de la creme, if you will, right? Sometimes the selection is about the specific film. And other times it's about being representative of a specific figure or body of work. We talked about this in past seasons. We talked about it when we had to do Laurel and Hardy's Big Business, right? Where everybody has a favorite Laurel and Hardy short. if I was picking a Laurel and Hardy short, it wouldn't necessarily be Big Business. It would be The Music Box, or it would be, one of those. But they went with Big Business because that is very emblematic of what their style was and what they did. And I think one of the things that makes Magical Maestro stand out in a way as the perfect registry selection is, while I don't know if you would find that many people who go, well, that is the single best Tex Avery short, it does contain the majority of his gags and his filmmaking style. We are incorporating one of his characters, which is Butch, and we are doing so many of his kind of bits. Be it like the little like frozen in time bits now with the wand, kind of frozen in thin air, like we mentioned the wolf being frozen in thin air when he's aroused. I don't know how else to put it, really.
Horned up.
Yeah, you've also got, the musical bits. You've unfortunately also got Tex Avery's love of ethnic humor. But you've got like that is kind of, that covers Tex Avery. If you had to pick one, like I said, in my sort of like Earth is about to explode, we need to load up a rocket ship, it does make sense to go with Magical Maestro, because it's like, well, if you have just one, you have to kind of capture every bit of that spirit.
It is funny though, because I think it would be different if The Mask had came out before they put a Tex Avery in. But also, not to say that I dislike this one. I do. I like this one plenty. It's funny, short. There is a Looney Tunes where Bugs is causing a ruckus as a conductor. So it feels like, I don't know, maybe something that isn't so closely associated with a Looney Tune, if you would, might have been a better selection for the sole Tex Avery entry in the registry. I mean, I'm sure 30 plus years ago they didn't think it'd be the only one, but if you were going in that order of like, well, we got Disney, we got this one, we got this one, now it's Tex's turn. I don't know. I don't necessarily know if I would have picked this one, but that's just me. I'm a wild card, a raconteur.
Well, so with that, I mean, we kind of talked about this earlier, but like, did Tex Avery need to be the next on that list? That's speaking from a position of now, not a position of 30 years ago, but was Tex Avery next in line, if you will?
Either way, I think at some point he was going to get in, I mean, especially since it's so, like Mike kind of just laid out very clearly, they were very almost specifically trying to do at least one. Yeah, like at least one or two each year of like kind of hitting the big guys as they go on. So even if they did rearrange the order a bit and Hanna-Barbera say did get in first, he was going to get in at some point, not to say anything against what you're saying about maybe why isn't Hanna-Barbera, Hanna-Barbera is more iconic, I think, in my opinion. We still keep trying to get reboots and comic books of Hanna-Barbera stuff where, again, I know pop culture, zeitgeist, iconography, all that doesn't necessarily have to come into play with what we're doing on the show. But when you're talking about, like, if you are going in order of stuff, Tex Avery stuff doesn't have the pop that still connects today as compared to, like, what you're saying, a Hanna-Barbera. Or what for...
And I just wonder, because I mean, I was 9 when this made it into the registry, and I was aware of these cartoons. My dad was an old cartoon fiend, and so I grew up watching cartoons, not necessarily with name recognition. The difference between the characters, the difference between the studios. You don't necessarily know the difference between the animators within the studios when you're a kid. But like, so I was aware at the time of this type of cartoon, but not of these characters. So I wonder what the thought process was that put Tex. We can't have the registry without a Tex Avery. And Mike, what you're saying is exactly right. Like, this is it has a little bit of all of the Tex Avery bits, but when you read the full essay of the entry, they don't really acknowledge the problematic parts. But I would argue that the problematic parts are why this short should be included, because this short is exactly the kind of mid-century racism that it would be very easily forgotten, or like, oh, let's not tell anybody about how racist all of this shit was, but in
Yeah.
fact, it was superhero racist. And like this short puts all of that in there
Yeah.
up front. So there's almost a level of like, yeah, it's really funny. Yeah, it's really well made. Yeah, it's, culturally, aesthetically significant for a lot of reasons, but it's culturally significant for really bad reasons too.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like not Birth of a Nation, but playing in that field in parts.
I agree. I think I will also say to that, when we're talking about, why Tex Avery and that urgency, it feels to me, when you listen to people who are of the previous generation, who are cartoon nerds, again, as we mentioned, the Joe Dantes and John Landises, there was also an element of the reason I think you go Tex Avery so soon is it feels like Tex Avery and Chuck Jones are treated in a similar fashion to Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton, where, and we've discussed it on this pod many times, but for a long time, Buster Keaton had almost like a hipster energy in terms of like one of the favorite
only the
things.
reals know.
Yeah. And it feels like because Chuck Jones, in addition to being prolific, Chuck Jones was also a lot more approachable. He got along with the studios better. Tex Avery got suspended by Warner Brothers. Tex Avery, after he finishes Magical Maestro, is like, I need a hiatus, and like walks away from shit, and like gets burnt out a lot, and is, even to people who were fans. There's a documentary on the very, very good, if anybody is interested in Tex Avery, interested in the stuff, the Warner Archives Blu-ray. They did a series of these of like Tex Avery screwball stuff. The restorations are gorgeous. And on volume 2, which is the one that has Magical Maestro, there is a documentary about Tex Avery. And when they talked to people that knew him, I'm attempting to prop this up behind me. I can't see what the hell I'm doing. When they talk to people that knew him, there's one guy they're talking to who's like, oh my God, I wrote Tex so many fan letters, and I always drew Screwy Squirrel on them to like show him how much I was a fan. I eventually met him and I said, I wrote you all these letters and I drew Screwy Squirrel with them. And he goes, anytime I saw a letter with Screwy Squirrel, I threw it right in the trash. I didn't want to see it. So meanwhile, like Chuck Jones, you see him in all of these old documentaries, right? Chuck Jones was like a lot more friendly. And so it feels like at the time that there is this animation reclamation, right? And let's not say, we keep mentioning Joe Dante. The other guy who was big behind this was Steven Spielberg, right? Spielberg was an obsessive cartoon fan. He basically made 1941 to be a big Chuck Jones, Tex Avery movie and referenced those guys a lot while he was making it. But there's the perfect example, right? Spielberg's making 1941 as a Chuck Jones, Tex Avery homage, brings in Chuck Jones at one point, right? Is talking to Chuck, just like, what would you do if you were doing this? Whereas Tex Avery seems like a lot more, prickly in regards. And so it seems like for people who are animation nerds in this period, baby boomer animation nerds, Tex Avery feels like the underdog. Like you can absolutely see a Joe Dante when he's in college telling people, yeah, Looney Tunes, the real shit is what Tex Avery was doing with MGM. Like that's the real shit. You don't see it anymore, but that's the real shit. There's more of a kind of underdog tragedy to Tex Avery that I think adds to that narrative at this particular time.
Which is funny because Joe Dante, as the preeminent king of animation nerds and filmmaking, even to this day, never really dug into the Tex Averyisms in his movies. He's referenced Disney cartoons. He's referenced Warner Brothers stuff, Looney Tunes. He's made a Looney Tunes movie, but you'd never really see Tex Avery stuff in his oeuvre. which is interesting. Not to say I'm making an argument that he doesn't like him. I'm not saying that. I just find it interesting that
Oh no, Gremlins 2 is pretty Tex Avery.
it's pretty Tex Avery, but it's
It's
still
not
kind of
overt,
just
but
it's still kind of stinker like Bugs Bunny.
I mean,
like
I'll back Jordan here because I'll say this, having watched a ton of Tex Avery in prep for this, there is no human being who would have been more on board with Lady Gremlin, sexy Lady Gremlin, than Tex Avery. Because the other thing we should represent, and now, Jordan, you work in the animation industry, right?
Mm-hmm.
You have encountered a lot of people in the animation industry, right? And we also all know stories of the animation industry. And I think it's safe to say that within the animation industry, when you encounter somebody who is like a real cartoon whiz, right? There's two ways that these conversations can go sometimes. They are either, in the Chuck Jones vein, more of like a really wholesome, fun kind of guy, or they're a guy who's like, do you want to see all my sketches of sexy dames? And you're like, oh, buddy, that's a lot of drawings of sexy dames, man. Tex Avery represents that classic cartoonist archetype of, but what about the sexy dames? There is a lot of that in his work. Amazingly, that is the one thing that is not in Magical Maestro, really. There is a sex joke in it with the rabbits, but there is not like his kind of typical curvaceous lady as appears in a lot of his stuff.
Yeah, and the rabbits are really tame for him too. I mean, the rabbits are a tongue-in-cheek thing. There's nothing all horned up in Magical Maestro.
Yeah.
So there's something we've been talking about, like this kind of boomer thing, which is really interesting because in thinking about this coming into it, my dad came from had a rough childhood and came from he was a child of divorce when that wasn't a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Similar to a guy like a Spielberg, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, people like kids who were raised by TVs because their parents were otherwise indisposed. And there's almost a level of like this. I know that my dad was introduced to these cartoons because he was a latchkey kid who was just watching what was on TV all the time. And I wonder, of course, he watched Looney Tunes because there were more of them and they were on more too. But I think my dad's introduction to this world, again, not necessarily by name, but by like, hey, watch this old thing, this really old thing, or this off the wall thing, we're all coming from memories of just being a latchkey kid who was like being left completely to his own devices while his parents weren't around, and he's eating a Hostess cupcake at 1:30 in the afternoon because he bailed from 8th grade, and he's hanging out at home watching whatever bootleg cartoons the local UHF channel is showing at 1:30 in the afternoon.
And
and that's where his appreciation for Tex Avery type stuff came from.
And I agree with that assessment, because I think that you also have to remember, especially at the time, the 5th year of the National Film Registry, who would be the people that are involved in making these selections? They would only be that exact category of person, right? The person who fell in love with movies from watching everything obsessively. And because animation and especially like cartoons are a little more niche, I would imagine that if it's a 12-person nomination board, you probably had 4 or 5 people on that board going, oh my God, we have to have Tex. Remember Magical Maestro? Or, but do I Love to Sing? No, it's got to be Magical Maestro because that's got the hair gag and it's got to be all that. And then the other like 7 people on the board going, whatever you say. You know what I mean? Like, I feel like that's
the people whose dads loved them were like, I'll give you whatever you want. Like, go for it.
And but I think
want a hug too?
I think that extends, like, because you mentioning like it's the stuff you grew up watching all the time, right? I think that's something that happens, generationally, because I do think like you similarly see it if you go to a Comic-Con now, right? And you talk to people our age versus a generation ahead of us, as in the generation before us. Talk to the generation before us. Yes, they will talk reverently about Tex Avery and Chuck Jones. And then you talk about the stuff that was on when we were kids, and they'll be like, oh, that was fun. And meanwhile, you talk to people our age and they'll be like, no, you do not understand. Peter Cullen's performance as Optimus Prime is legitimately good. Like, it needs to be discussed, and it's like we talk about some of those people in the similar way that those people talked about like a Mel Blanc or a Paul Frees, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Kevin
so
Conroy is Batman, and I will not move off of this.
correct. And so I wonder, like,
That's-
when our children are older, will they have this ingrained reverence for a Kevin Conroy or a Peter Cullen, or one of those, in the same way that we kind of all had from our parents an ingrained reverence for Mel Blanc, right? Where, like, by the time we're coming up, like, Mel Blanc is in documentaries and we're talking about Mel Blanc and we're talking about these guys,
My son recently discovered Powerpuff Girls.
Oh.
And I say he discovered it as if I didn't turn it on and say, you got to see this. But like kind of reached the end of HBO's, or I'm sorry, Max's, old Cartoon Network library and Boomerang and everything else. And we were just going through stuff, and he's seen every episode of so many things, which are great. I mean, The Amazing World of Gumball is a fantastic show. We Bare Bears is a fantastic show.
I love We Bare Bears.
There was some really good stuff that Cartoon Network, they had a revival about, in the latter part of the 2010s that was just some amazing output. But we were just looking for something to watch, and I said, you've probably never seen this. And I turned on Powerpuff Girls, and his eyes got huge. And I was like, dude, you don't understand. Wait till your mom gets home and tell her what we were watching, because that is like, was her show. When we were in our 20s, or, late teens and 20s. So like, we weren't even the little kids that it was aimed at, but it was seminal viewing.
I mean,
and he just, like, now he has this reverential behavior, but like, to him, Powerpuff Girls or Johnny Bravo or whatever, that's the classics.
Well, it's funny you say that, because it clicked in for me, like, thinking about, animation as auteurs, talking about Tex Avery, Chuck Jones, the one that is actually true for, I think, for people our age.
Gendy Tartakovsky.
Exactly what I was going to say. Because when you hear about, like, I remember the feeling, like, around school, even people who weren't cartoon nerds at all, being like, well, hold on. Who's making a Clone Wars cartoon? I know what that's going to look like. I know what that's going to feel like, like Samurai Jack and Clone Wars and all that. Gendy Tartakovsky has that. Yeah.
And someday he's going to make his Popeye movie, by God. But someday that movie's going to happen.
That I have watched that test footage more times than I want to admit.
The fact that he made them a boatload of money with 3 of those Hotel fucking Transylvania movies, which I like. I'm not saying it derisively, but it's like he keeps doing the one for you. All right, a second one for you. All right, a third one for you.
And he drew the line of the 4th. He was like, I'm not doing this 4th one, by God.
But it's like, those movies made an ass load of money. Like,
and they're
give the guy money to make a Popeye. Yeah, they are good. Like, I like, for something I thought I would not have liked, I listening to them talk about it on Blank Check, I'm like, okay, so it sounds like Gendy got to bring a bit of his flair to it, and it feels like an actual cartoon and not just, Bubble Boy, drawings come to life like every fucking post Pixar movie does, which is kind of why I've had this talk with Mike about it. I actually really liked Turning Red, which was like, oh, this feels like a cartoon where, like, the proportions will change and they get, reality can,
get some
alter and what have you.
Squash and stretch,
Squash and stretch, not stretch and switch,
Squash and stretch. So it's just weird that, like, I guess he got his one for him with 2 seasons of Primal, which is like, hey, cool, metal as fuck, man, and his T-Rex. That's right up my alley. But, like, I want to see a sailor eat some spinach and fight some dudes because he's trying to bang a broad.
Like, well, great, because I've already written up my pitch for a gritty neo-realist version of Popeye.
Well, some jackoff already made the public domain Popeye slasher movie, so time to Luigi that guy. from Luigi's Mansion.
And by that, I was going to
Yeah.
say, Tom, by that you mean put him in a mansion
I'm-
with a flashlight where he needs to suck up ghosts in a vacuum cleaner.
Yes, I'm going to haunt his house.
So,
Luigi is a verb now.
I want to take a moment because one thing we kind of haven't done in all of this, and I think I understand it because, as we said, this feels like Magical Maestro has chosen to be the Tex Avery, right? And also the MGM animation. But I do want to take a moment to talk about the actual content of the film itself, with what time we have. Because one thing I think is interesting in watching it, and we will also talk about the bad stuff, but the one thing I want to talk about is another element is it feels like Magical Maestro is Tex Avery working out gags he couldn't make work before. One perfect example is a bit that may not make sense to our younger listeners. Because if you didn't grow up watching film and film projection, this means nothing to you. But when you watched film projected, sometimes a hair would fall in the projector, right? Or sometimes it would fall on the film itself. There would be these little kind of like tiny little hairs, right, that you would see on a couple frames. And if you guys obviously noticed in this film, there's the bit where Puccini, even though everything else has been about Puccini not having any control, he takes a break from what he's doing to pluck a hair out of the frame. Right?
That is probably the best bit in the whole short, because the first time I watched it, I mean, not first time, I definitely saw this when I was a kid, but first time I watched it months ago, knowing this was coming, just to refresh my memory. I remember watching it thinking, oh, the copy I got, they probably, whatever transfer they had, there was a hair on the film.
It's a dirty transfer.
And once he plucked it out, I was like, oh, this is great. I love that. That's I wish more of that was in, not just that, but in any animated movie. Just like, hey, let's fuck with the medium, like reality is already out the window. These are drawings come to life.
And not only that, but I was watching it with my son, my 10-year-old. And when that started, he actually, because first of all, the only place you can stream this in high definition, like not, super compressed, is on archive.org.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's not on YouTube, it's not on HBO, it's not anywhere streaming. So, but there's a decent stream of it on archive.org. And when that gag started, my son like pointed it out. It was like, is that supposed to be happening? So there's something that's like weirdly, and my, kid, we have to pause things a lot so I can give him a little film history lesson that he's not listening to, when we're watching a lot of things. But that one was like, wow, this is such an effective gag, because a 10-year-old, years and years and years after that joke was ever relevant, still noticed it and enjoyed it. Like he didn't get the significance of projector schmutz and that you'd be seeing this in the theater as but like he totally vibed with the joke. And it caught him by surprise.
One of the things that's interesting is so he had actually Avery had tried to do that bit. Well, he does do that bit in an earlier short. I was talking to you guys about it off mic, called Aviation Vacation, where the gimmick in that is we're watching an Irishman sing when Irish eyes are smiling, right? And he's singing, when Irish eyes are smiling, and then the hair pops up in the bottom of the frame, and it's, doing its thing. And he takes a break, and in a very Looney Tunes voice goes, "Hey, get it out of here!" And the animator's hand reaches down and plucks out the hair. The bit doesn't work as well, and it's not just because of the joke construction. A thing I noticed is that in Aviation Vacation, the hair is doing so much conspicuous movement, right? It's always on screen, and it's moving fluidly, right? And it's drawing so much attention to itself that you clock it, and you're like, that's going to matter. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's so deliberate.
Like
and so when you
hair.
Yeah, exactly. And then when you watch Magical Maestro and you realize, like, even that, like, the hair is like, it'll show up for a second, it'll fly off screen, it'll show up for a second. He figured out how to make it look more natural. And so much of Magical Maestro, when you watch it, is made up of bits that Tex had done before, but not as effectively. And you're sort of seeing him fix what he couldn't do before. And in a lot of ways, seeing him, maybe, I don't know, maybe some of it is him going like, Warner Brothers fucked this up, right? Warner Brothers fucked up the pacing on this, or Warner Brothers fucked this up. I'm an MGM. I'm going to do this the way I wanted to do it.
So there's something else about this particular film that I was considering, and I don't know. I didn't have a chance to like look into the answers on this. So that's why I said at the top, I'm going to be asking more questions than bring in anything. But he made the movie in 1950 and it was released in 52. So he was already like on his sabbatical by the time it was put into theaters, right? So the MGM cartoon division only lasted a couple more years after this was released. And I was sitting here thinking like 1952, MGM put out Singing in the Rain that same year, right? Like MGM was in the business of big spectacle, and they'd been in the business of big spectacle for years at this point. You know, they were actually like on the downward slope of MGM's big spectacle. They just didn't know it yet. But there was something about this film and like the crowd shots when he has these gorgeously illustrated exterior of the theater, or like the long shot of the audience where all of the characters have this beautiful illustration that's frankly unnecessarily beautiful, because so much effort and attention went into this stuff that MGM wasn't going to be doing for much longer. You know, certainly Tex Avery was going to come back and do the UPA style, and they were going to shutter the animation thing anyway. Like, and I just couldn't help but think, what did Louis B. Mayer think about cartoons? Like, what did he give a shit about any of this? You know, or was this just Tex Avery getting to do a big grand finale for the MGM cartoon division before it was like, you know, not finale, but you know what I mean? Like it was on the way out. And also, like on that same train of thought, we were talking about our parents experiencing these things on TV. The theatrical short, I mean, that whole hair bit only works if you're watching the movie. Like, I mean, it works anyway because it's a funny joke, but it was designed for watching the short as part of a block in a theater. Well, if he made it in 1950 and it came out in 1952, how much longer were cartoons part of a normal viewing block? Not much.
Longer than we think, though. They
Really?
fade in popularity, but in fact, I'm gonna forget the studio. I don't think it was United Artists is still doing those Pink Panther shorts into like the
those weren't for TV?
70s. They were getting released with their stuff in theaters.
Huh.
The thing is, it's more so, because one thing to remember is, especially when we get into the 70s, right? The 60s and 70s, the boom of animation studios, right? Making these shorts and putting money into these shorts is gone. But there's also the situation of there's not a lot of options for families at the theaters in the 70s, right?
Right.
And so when you do put out a family film, you are going to shove a cartoon in front of it. They're not the cartoons that anybody but us freaks remember, is the thing, right? So Bugs Bunny isn't in shorts by the 60s and 70s. And, Mickey Mouse isn't. But Bunny and Claude are, right? Because Bunny and Claude are a parody of the Warren Beatty,
Right.
Bonnie and Clyde. We just don't talk about them, and they don't get played much because they aren't particularly good. So there are still theatrical cartoon shorts before certain movies. They just aren't particularly noteworthy, and they're attached to films that also aren't particularly noteworthy.
So there are exceptions to that, but I'm thinking more like the MGM. So we know that
For sure.
MGM is riding high into the 50s, right?
Yeah.
And MGM is absolutely, crushing the game for a few more years. The studio system is going to collapse 15 years after this short comes out. To like in the original context of it.
Yeah.
I mean, it never really dies, but you know what I mean? So I just had this feeling of kind of like, this almost feels like a high watermark
Yeah.
for studio driven big budget shorts that the studio in question, MGM, is soon to lose interest in.
Yeah.
And the film industry in general is going to lose interest in. And now you have these like curios almost of this short that was made very specifically for like a 1940s audience, that is now being served to 1950s increasingly television distribution.
I would also say another reason it stands out is it's not formulaic, right? You mentioned Hanna-Barbera, and you mentioned these, Tom and Jerry. Tom and Jerry wins a bunch of Oscars around this period, right? In the 40s, like the Tom and Jerry shorts win a bunch of Oscars. People would be surprised how many Oscars Tom and Jerry won. Mr. Magoo wins 2 Oscars, right?
I don't believe that for a second.
Yep. There's 2 of them. I forget what one of them is, but the other is called When Magoo Flew. But Mr. Magoo wins 2 Oscars. But the thing about it, and my significant other loves Tom and Jerry. She grew up watching Tom and Jerry, and I have said, like, I'm not the biggest Tom and Jerry guy for the fact that when you sit down, if you watch a Tom and Jerry short on a given day, you have a good time. If you watch like 3 or 4 back to back, you reach a point where you're like, well, it's kind of just doing the same. It's kind of just doing the same.
Tom and Jerry's
bit.
best short is when is a Tom and Jerry at doing an opera thing or doing a classical
Cat
music
Concerto.
Piece. Well, they did it like 4 times.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm just saying, if Tom is in a tuxedo and he's conducting an orchestra, you're going to have a good time.
Yeah.
But pick one.
But that's my point is like when I would imagine, especially for the people who are deciding on the registry at this time, like looking at the state of animation at that point too, like there isn't anything formulaic about Magical Maestro insofar as it's like a standard plot, but it's not like, well, this is one of 17 times that the magician has antagonized Butch the dog. Whereas I'd imagine, like, especially at that point, in the 90s, you're probably looking at the more formulaic cartoons and going like, well, that's not really like, I don't need that. This is the real juice here.
And we're also talking about, I'm not going to say like the high point of film snobbery, but definitely within that, one of my biggest soapboxes is about the 20th century hierarchy of filmed entertainment that we still operate under, where movies are on top, TV, video games, whatever other filmed narrative entertainment exists is somehow inferior to single scripted narratives. And we still kind of operate under that paradigm, even though it's patently untrue at this point. So when you're looking at that period, when I said Hanna-Barbera, I just realized myself, every Hanna-Barbera title I named was a TV show.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, Hanna-Barbera should be in the registry first. Where are the Flintstones? Where are the Jetsons? Like, well, they're on TV, and this is the film registry, and they're not going to respect TV in 1994 because that's how it went. Film was more important, and it was inherently more valuable than TV.
I mean, to prove your point, Jordan, obviously Star Trek is a TV show, but it's had many successful movies. Do you know how long it took for a Star Trek film to get into the National Film Registry?
Are there any?
This year. Wrath of Khan got in this year. It took until now. Yeah. It took longer than I have been alive.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but are there any episodic TV shows in the registry at this point?
Not really, no. I mean, there's things that aired on television where it gets a little murky, but not in the most literal sense. No.
So if you're going to consider the American film registry, the word film is in that, but motion picture is not just constrained to single narrative feature films. I mean, we live in an age where YouTube, there's a YouTuber from North Carolina who's the biggest film studio in the world right now. You know, like Mr. Beast's output is highly, you know, dwarfs the output and the success metrics of a number of Hollywood film studios. The best scripted entertainment I saw all last year was WrestleMania 40. So, like,
Did you only watch WrestleMania 40 then?
well, I didn't watch any AEW, if that's what you're asking, but
well, I just mean in general, like you could probably watch anything Tyler Perry puts out, and it would be of a higher quality than what the Fed does.
Hang on, no, sir.
I need to jump in.
We go.
I need to jump in. Hang on, I need to check for 1 second because we'll get off wrestling and we'll start winding down. But before I do that, no, Jordan, tribalism aside, you of all people need to be watching at least some bits of AEW because I don't know if you're aware of this. Ben Mankiewicz has been on several times. Yes.
Timeless
so as long
Tony
as
Storm
you know
is an
that,
amazing character.
As long as you are aware that Ben Mankiewicz of Turner Classic Movies has appeared on a wrestling program several times, then I'm fine. And that's what you need to know.
Timeless Tony Storm is an amazing character, and I'm sure AEW has some amazing products, but there's only so many hours in the week, and the TV is tuned to Raw and SmackDown enough that we don't need to give up all of the rest of our time to every other.
No, it's fine. You guys watch 7 hours of wrestling and get 2 matches a week. It's fine. I get it.
Yeah, but then we get all the Sami Zayn promos, and that is cinema. That is cinema.
We are so deep. We are too deep in this episode to do this.
All right.
Now, let's...
All right. To just latch on to what Jordan was saying. Yes, the registry has sort of broadened its scope on what can count in this registry and what counts as film or motion picture or whatnot. We've made the jokes, but you know we're going to have to do it because it's in the registry. The Zapruder film is in the registry. Test Pattern is in the registry. Fucking a year or 2 or 3 ago, they put Cab Calloway's home videos in the registry. Home videos. I mean, like at a certain point, it then has to start becoming okay. Well, how do we tackle the TV thing now? Because I mean, do you want to put the first episode of Gunsmoke in? Do you want to put that first episode of Dragnet in? Does maybe the pilot of Twin Peaks count?
Yeah, I Love Lucy. I mean, are you going to put an entire series like an I Love Lucy or something? You know,
Honeymooners. I mean, like, well, you know, the scope has now gotten so far afield of not just like feature film, but also just like shown in a movie theater. You know, there's shit that was only ever seen at Cab Calloway's house. I mean, not to besmirch the choice of Cab Calloway's home videos. It's one of my favorite things they've ever done because it's so goddamn bizarre. But like nobody that's like if you put $1 bet. Oh, I'm going to bet that Cab Calloway's home videos are making their registry this year. You have just made $1 billion.
What if that's... Okay, you know what? I have often said that I want to be careful about who sponsors and supports this program. I want to be clear. Any of these like DraftKings style like gambling outlets, the only way I endorse it is if you will open up a section to specifically gamble on what gets into the National Film Registry. I will back that one thing in particular. Nothing else. I do not support gambling being legal in most capacities. But in this one instance, we should be allowed to do it. God damn it! This one thing, I'm on board for.
Opening my FanDuel account right now.
Offer code registry.
The Blue Boy episode of Dragnet is making it in 2026.
Offer code Cab Calloway.
So before we wind down. This is a tough one because it's like, as you mentioned, Jordan, it's something it's really rough. We should at least acknowledge that this short is
Currently running for office.
It's so full
it won.
of so full of offensive stereotypes and ethnic humor that you couldn't even censor it, really.
I
wonder,
honestly was so like when they did the Asian bit,
yeah.
I was like, okay, I guess this is the height of what's gonna happen here. And then we get blackface, and I was like, well, at least I can still be surprised at 34. Yes, at least I can still be surprised at 34. And having seen many a problematic thing in my day, but I was still like, oh wow, he threw a knuckleball. Okay.
Well,
I
Tom,
did not see that curve coming.
See, you're leaving out a crucial component of that, which is the thing that's really jarring. Is so as we mentioned,
then it becomes a small blackface.
That's the thing. Is that it's and not only does it become smaller, but that you do a bit where he's ink is sprayed on his face, so he is singing as an African American crooner with a sweet melodic voice, and you're like, this is bad because it's a blackface joke. However, at the very least, he's not doing a crude voice. And then he gets hit with an anvil and proceeds to do a much cruder voice. And it's like, somehow you did a bad thing and then made it worse. And
much like America in 2024.
Yeah,
folks, I'm here for all your topical humor. I will be replacing Jon Stewart on The Daily Show.
And the thing it's worth noting is that this type of humor, there's a lot of stuff, we're going to be talking Marx Brothers this season, and certainly there's ethnic humor in the Marx Brothers films, and drawing the line between what was socially acceptable, quote unquote, ethnic humor during one period and when it becomes racial stereotypes is a little trickier than I think some people want to acknowledge. I'm not saying that in particular when it comes to depictions of African Americans in cinema, but certain things like, for example, Chico Marx, right? Chico Marx doing his Italian impression, but I grew up in a family full of Italians who loved Chico Marx, right? That was the idea of ethnic humor then. And I say all that to say, virtually all of the stereotype humor that is in this film is already gauche by the time this film comes out. Like, that is a thing that needs to be acknowledged, is that the content in this is already on the outs. It's a little bit like when the blackface humor happens in this, it feels a little bit like, do you guys remember the episode of Mad Men where Roger Sterling has his backyard party and he comes out in blackface? And it's an important scene for a historical document because it is kind of showing the reaction of the crowd, and particularly like Pete Campbell's character being like, this is like his face just showing like, this is repugnant. And like the older people are chuckling, but a lot of like the middle-aged and younger people are like, this stays in the past.
It's also just, it's just lazy. I think there's definitely ways to make racial humor that isn't just lazy, because in this it just kind of comes out of nowhere. Like, it's not like a bit where each time it's a racial stereotype joke or whatever. So it's kind of like, all right, well, I guess that's the bit. The guy, the dog is making the other dog is making Puccini look bad on stage by being a racial stereotype, blah, blah, blah. It's just like, all right, well, he's a football player now.
Well,
and then like he's doing it. And it's literally just, oh, we got a gong, and the gong, like, that turns him into a Chinese or Japanese, or so, as they would say in the day, an Oriental type. Like, we just go like, all right, well, like, what's even the joke, man? Like, it's just not even. It's just, I guess the word is what might say. It's just gauche. It's just not funny. It's like, I mean, I don't know.
There are ways to do racial. I mean, even today, in a much more sensitive and aware time period, I mean, you can still make a Tropic Thunder. And I say you can make a Tropic Thunder right now, and Tropic Thunder is actually, in fact, a fairly old movie at this point. but
Yeah.
but Tropic Thunder still was a movie that was about satirizing the insanity of of blackface and of that kind of insensitive filmmaking. And Robert Downey Jr. went for it, and I'm sure that he had a long, thought process of like, am I going to do this? Is this something I want to put my name on? And ultimately he found a way, I think very successfully, to do that without causing offense, because the whole point was how offensive it is. At some point somebody's got to play the offensive part,
Well,
right?
it's recently Anthony Jeselnik did a special, and in the lead up to the special was doing a lot of interviews, and he talks about how, like, my persona is the guy who makes all the offensive jokes and blah blah blah, and someone's in one of the interviews like, well, is there anything you wouldn't do? And he goes, yeah, I wouldn't say the N word or the F word. I'll still make black jokes and I'll still make gay jokes, but once you say those two words, you've immediately lost the audience, and then they're not laughing, and then you're doing a bad job. Which is him also going after the hack comedians that are just like, oh, what,
Yeah.
you're mad, I'm just trying to. It's like, no, if you're not making them laugh and they're mad, you failed at your job. There's no other way about it. Get as defensive as you want. So I think it kind of gets to that point of, there is a Rubicon that you cross, that once you become unnecessarily and lazily crude, then it just becomes like, all right, well, this just isn't funny. Like, it doesn't take a deep comedic mind to go in the middle of like a crowded movie theater and just like shout the N word and just, well, that's all right, buddy. Takes a lot of balls to do it, depending on what theater you're in, but that doesn't mean you're funny.
Yeah. I mean, mileage may vary, but like the difference between a Tropic Thunder and a Blazing Saddles is vastly different to comedians who are just a white guy who drops an N-bomb and then is like, what, you gonna cancel me now? Like, kind of. Yeah, that was a total dick move for no reason. And so I think the question, I don't even think it's really a question, was Avery just making a total dick move for no reason? I think, yeah, he was, because that's who he was, and that was his sense of humor. And again, your mileage may vary on whether or not that was period appropriate or not, because there were plenty of people in the period who were like, that's not okay, in a lot of other ways. But in terms of, does this belong in the National Film Registry, then I kind of think it does, as that important historical document, not as a celebration, but as a, like, yeah, super racist stuff was mainstream.
Yeah.
And
It's
Casually
also worth,
racist, I think, is what makes it important. It's just
Yes,
how, like, tossed off it is.
It's also worth noting, and I'm not trying to say this to absolve Tex Avery, but it's also important to remember, like, he's not young when he's making this. And it's important to remember that, like, part of the reason he finds this stuff funny is he was a boy raised in Texas in the 1910s who may or may not have been the descendant of Judge Roy Bean. I don't think he's growing up in the most enlightened household.
He's from Mississippi and growing up in Texas, and like that's an indictment of his life, his upbringing, for sure. And I don't know, I felt one thing that I was watching this with my son, and as soon as the native bit went, he cocked his head, but we've watched enough old cartoons. He's like, okay, you get one, I guess. And then the bit with the gong happened, and he turned into that gif of the guy saying oof.
Yeah.
And then the blackface thing happened, and he's just sitting over here going, oh.
And by the way, I bring that up not to defend, but rather to make the point that, like, we're talking about contemporary comedians who say these things to be shocking, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's important to stress that when Tex Avery is doing this and doing these bits, he is not doing it to be provocative. He is not coming from a place of knowing that these things are not considered appropriate in polite society and doing it anyway to jab people. It's much simpler than that. He is doing it because to him, that is funny. And that's
clearly
not,
it's not just funny to him, it's funny to the whole audience, or else MGM wouldn't have released it.
Right. Right. And that's what I'm saying is like, I do think for especially our younger listeners, like that is an important thing to understand, is that like in the 50s and 60s, in this particular period of cinema, you're dealing with a guy who was born in 1908, right? So he's not doing it to push back against, mid-century wokeness. He's doing it because in his mind, this is a legitimate form of humor. And the culture has started to move on at this point, not as much as we would like it to have at this period of time, but, the culture has moved on a little bit, and he hasn't. But
I think for in terms of like the 1994 question, why was this selected in 1994, and what were the thoughts on it in 1994? This is from the essay, and I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit. But it isn't enough that the ink sprayed from the pen turns Puccini into a black-faced character, but Avery has to top even that by having the heckler drop an anvil on Puccini. So now squashed, he sings with a deep, gravelly black voice. When the gag's worn out its welcome, a firefighter rabbit sprays the ink off with a hose. So the writer who inducted this into the registry says, when that gag's worn out its welcome. And that struck me so much. Like, that gag wore out its welcome around 1863. Like that gag is not welcome ever.
Yeah.
But when you're writing, when Tex Avery's making this film in 1950, when MGM's releasing it in 1952, you can see people going, okay, yeah, that's funny, and just make sure that it's, peppy and snappy. But when a guy's writing about it in 1994, he's like, oh yeah, and that when that one gets tired, guess what he has on deck next? And I'm like, my God,
I'll say to that, I think we have to kind of roll with the fact that they are talking about this inappropriate bit from a thing they grew up with, similar to, quite frankly, and listen, Jordan, you're already, a parent, and it's something that I think about with my future, like the idea of there's going to be certain movies and there's going to be certain things that I grew up laughing at. Like if one day I have a kid and Revenge of the Nerds pops up or Animal House or one of those, there's going to be things. And the reality is I'm going to talk about that with the same tone that this essay writer is talking about this cartoon they grew up watching, which is, yes, it's unfortunate that was what they were doing at the time. Anyway, moving on. There was like, where we who are younger kind of look at this stuff and go like, no, somebody needs to say this is not okay. Like, I'm not laughing. For the previous generation, there is that feeling of like, yeah, look, we don't laugh at this anymore and we wouldn't do this now. But like, hey, that was just the bit at the time. There's stuff, talk about stuff that's still in the air. There's stuff from like season 1, season 2, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia that like we watch and go, oh yeah, you can't be doing that. Can't be doing that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much stuff in like early Wes Anderson films that I've thought about sharing with my son. And then I remember, oh, wait a second. That's going to require explanation. That's going to require context. Like, we can't watch Rushmore until, you're going to have to be cool with some stuff before we can watch some of these movies.
Yeah. And it's just about understanding the context and having that sense of context, which I think some people inherently had. All of that being said, because we have successfully quintupled the length of this film at bare minimum, and also talked more about the Country Bears than the length of the film. Winding down, as we always do. Tom, how do you think Magical Maestro performed at the Academy Awards that year? You are correct. However, that doesn't mean that Tex Avery came up empty-handed at the Academy Awards that year. So Magical Maestro was not nominated for anything, but it could have been nominated for Best Short Subject Cartoons. One of the nominees in that category was Little Johnny Jet, a different Tex Avery short. It's a cartoon about a dad airplane who finds out his son is a jet plane and he's disappointed in him. It's actually a remake of an earlier short that was I think it's called like One Cab Family or something like that. That's about like a family of cars, and it's a taxi cab whose son becomes a drag racer or something. But in any event, Little Johnny Jet, that's a Tex Avery short that is nominated that year. The other nominees: Madeline, an adaptation of the children's book Madeline; Pink and Blue Blues, a Mr. Magoo short; a short called The Romance of Transportation in Canada, which marks the first time a non-American animated short is nominated. And the winner that year in the category, Johann Mouse, which is a Tom and Jerry short where you put them with classical music. So, Jordan, you called it 15 minutes ago. The Academy was like, he's right. That's what it is.
They're great.
For a little more context, the Best Picture nominees that year were High Noon, Ivanhoe, Moulin Rouge, The Quiet Man, and the winner that year, The Greatest Show on Earth. So that was what the Oscars looked like that year. Obviously, Magical Maestro not part of the Oscar conversation, but Little Johnny Jet is not part of the National Film Registry conversation. So which one really stands the test of time is the question. And as we just discussed, more so this one, but not entirely. Not entirely.
Big question is, yes.
Jordan, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for stepping outside of the Disney bubble on our show and taking it to MGM. Normally this is where we say like, oh, we hope you'll come back, but we won't say what, but we have we have talked to you off camera about what you're coming back for next time. And let's just say very different from anything else you have covered on this show. Just so far.
Macho Man. It's going to be Macho Man versus Ricky Steamboat at WrestleMania 3.
Well, see, now we're talking about a good WrestleMania.
Cat's out of the bag. It's gonna be epic.
I mean, that's good because I didn't want to tell you. We did manage to get a big name guest for Undertaker versus Mankind Hell in a Cell. So I know that was also on your list. I didn't want to. You got bumped. We couldn't help it. That's
Son of a...
Yeah, that's unfortunately. Colson Whitehead's people got back to us, said he's available. So
it's actually going to be Ben Mankiewicz talking about.
Ben Mankiewicz.
This was awesome, guys. Thanks
Jordan,
for
so
indulging.
Much. Before you go, do you have anything you want to plug? Let folks know where to find you. Any projects? Anything you want to tell folks about?
Yeah, I mean, so now for something completely different, but one of the things that I'm working on these days is I work with the Fizzy's Lunch Lab brand. It was actually the first PBS Kids nutrition series, or PBS Kids web series. It's a nutrition show that earned Emmy nominations back in the early 2000s, and we've brought it back as a YouTube series first and foremost, and streaming some other places, so you can look up Fizzy's Lunch Lab out there. But in that conversation of what qualifies as filmed entertainment, that's something that I'm very keenly aware of right now. Is this is a digital show, but has all of these lives and all of these other pockets, and how far we've come from the days of one little hair gag for a theatrical audience that gets a film into a national film registry, even though nobody alive saw it in a theater.
Well, Jordan, we always enjoy having you on. We can't wait to have you back in a, as we said, very different context. But
awesome. Thank you, guys.
While we will see you next season, everybody else stick around because we'll be right back with our picks for the National Film Registry.
See you, boys.
The National Film Registry isn't some fixed object, frozen in time. It's always growing, adding new titles every year. These annual selections are made by the National Film Preservation Board, with members like Martin Scorsese, Alfre Woodard, and Leonard Maltin, and representatives from organizations like the Academy, the DGA, and the AFI coming together to debate and decide. But they don't just pull titles out of thin air. They pull from the public, people like you and us, who can submit their nominations for the registry in a form on the Library of Congress's website. What we do, at the end of each episode, is have Mike and Tom pick films not yet in the registry that they feel should be, inspired by that day's topic. At the end of each season, those films will be formally submitted to the National Film Registry for consideration, on behalf of You're Missing Out. Here are today's picks.
All right, I'm gonna make this pretty short and simple. It's the first thing that came to mind. Double checked on the Google Doc that we didn't, either you or me picked this before. It wasn't. I mentioned it in the show. It's The Mask. I mean, the biggest thing Tex Avery did that Tex Avery had no part in doing, kind of kept the Tex Avery brand alive in the 90s. And it's also got, well, if you want to talk about, historical films, Jim Carrey's one of the biggest stars of the 90s, one of the most iconic comedians of the last 30, 40 years. And that year of his, 94, with The Mask, Dumb and Dumber, and Ace Ventura, you kind of can't really go better for sort of like a breakout than having those three movies. And I think The Mask is the best of them. You're going to I feel like you got to get to Jim Carrey at some point. So tie it into this. I think The Mask is great. Feels like a Tex Avery cartoon come to life. Best use of Jim Carrey's talents. It's great. It's fun. Tex Avery direct tie-ins. My pick is The Mask. Do it.
So for me, it's funny. It's kind of tied to Tom's because Tom's like, well, you have to, The Mask represents Tex Avery. We were talking all on an episode about like, the Tex Avery wolf, right? And to me, I think you have to go straight to the source. It is astounding to me that Red Hot Riding Hood is not in the registry. As Tom noted in the episode, like everybody using the gif of the wolf with the eyes bugging out or the jaw dropping, like those classic things that do get copied in The Mask and get copied in so many cartoons. And Who Framed Roger Rabbit? They come from Red Hot Riding Hood. It's such a clever little short. It's such a great piece of animation iconography. It is weird that there's not more Tex Avery in the registry. I was kind of like coin flip between Red Hot Riding Hood and my personal favorite, which is I Love to Singa, the little owl short. But Red Hot Riding Hood feels like such a quintessential piece of American animation, such a part of the cultural lexicon that it's impossible not to include it. And tell you the truth, I rewatched it before we came on, and as opposed to the film we're talking about today, nothing that objectionable in it. So I think it's just a perfect answer, and I think especially for this, and especially to get more Tex Avery in, 1943's Red Hot Riding Hood is my pick for the National Film Registry.
Next week,
we're doing a feature-length commentary track for 1916's landmark film, Where Are My Children?
I think that Mike is right. I think in this case, like abortion and birth control are being viewed as very different things, and eugenics is the thread that's kind of tying them and both of the classes together. Like they would have very desirable babies in the mindset of this film.
You're Missing Out is a production of Neon Night Media. It's hosted by Mike Natale and Tom Lorenzo. The show is produced by Kyle Lampar and edited by Mike Natale and Kyle Lampar. More information about our hosts and guests are in the show notes. Thank you to Amanda Rush for our social media, and all of you for checking us out.
If you're listening right now or want to take the show on the go, every episode is available as an audio podcast. Follow You're Missing Out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like what you hear, please leave a review and a rating. It helps folks find the show.
Want to watch the show or watch some of the films along with us? Great, that's why we're doing this. Don't leave us alone out here. Check out our YouTube channel. We've got video versions of every episode, uploads of some of the National Film Registry titles we're discussing, commentary tracks, and live streams. And once a month, I'll be uploading some content that's exclusive to the YouTube channel. So be sure to click subscribe and hit that little bell to be notified as soon as new stuff goes up. Because, let's be fucking real, I ain't sticking to a goddamn schedule.
So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
And we'll see you next time.
And you'll see us next time. Because we don't watch you, you're watching us.